last week we finished up with 19, and so this week we're going to start with chapter 20 in Matthew. And chapter 20 kind of starts with a parable that is related to chapter 19. So just a little recap for those of you who weren't here last week with chapter 19, that we studied the story of the rich man who came to Jesus and said, "What good thing must I do to get eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Keep the commandments." And the rich man says, "I did. What do I still lack?" And Jesus, apparently, we question whether Jesus really believed that he did keep some of those commandments. And so he said, "Well, give away everything and follow me." And so you know what the rich man did. He just says, "Oh, that's a little bit too much. I don't think eternal life's for me." Tiger boy, get down. And so then after that, Jesus, if you remember the thing that he said about it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. And we studied that a little bit, knowing that the camel, the eye of the needle, might actually be, there's a small gate in a walled city. They have a big gate and a small gate, and the small gate, it's very difficult for a man to walk through. You have to lean over to get through it. Is called the eye of the needle. And so they were thinking that that might be that, or it might be a cable, trying to put a cable, because the same word in Greek is all for camel. It sounds a lot like cable. So it could be that putting a cable through the eye of a needle might be. So we studied that a little bit. And then after all of that, the disciples were saying, "Well, who can be saved then? If it's difficult, for a rich person to get through the eye of a needle." And Jesus tells them that with man, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. And so that's followed up after all of that study about rich and how hard it is and the dangers of being wealthy. Then I'm just going to read the last passage in 19, where Peter says the "what's in it for us" message, where Peter said, "We have left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us?" And Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And anyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or fathers or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first." So we talked a little bit about that last week too. And so that's the end of chapter 19. And then we begin chapter 20. Sarah, would you read the parable of the workers in the vineyard, which is 1 through 16?
Okay. "For the situation in the kingdom of heaven is like what happened when a householder went out first thing in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. When he had come to an agreement with them that they would work for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. He went out again about 9 a.m. and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. He said to them, 'Go you also into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' And they went. He went out again about 12 noon and about 3 p.m. and did the same. About 5 p.m. he went out and found others standing there and said to them, 'Why are you standing here the whole day idle?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'Go you also to the vineyard.' When evening came, the master of the vineyard said to his steward, 'Call the workers and give them their pay, beginning from the last and going on until you come to the first.' So when those who had been engaged about 5 p.m. came, they received a denarius each. Those who had come first thought that they would receive more, but they too received a denarius each. When they received it, they grumblingly complained against the master. 'These last,' they said, 'have only worked for 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the the burden and the hot wind of the day? He answered one of them, Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not come to an agreement with me to work for 1 denarius? Take what is yours and go. It is my will to give this last man the same as to you. Can I not do what I like with my own money? Or are you grudging because I am generous? Even so, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last.
Yeah. Barclay kind of mentions that this may sound like kind of a extremes kind of story, but that he said that this happened very frequently in Palestine. That when the grape harvest comes in, that you've got to get all of those grapes harvested before it rains, and if you don't, then the whole thing is ruined. So they'll try to get as many workers in as they can. And so the harvest is really a frantic time. And so he also mentioned that there were a lot of people who were living day to day just by the labor that they can get. I remember driving down the streets, driving down Hull Street and various streets, and having areas where workers used to go and wait for people to come pick them up in trucks to take them out to work somewhere for the day. And that these workers, a denarius, Barclay explains, is like the minimum wage. If you get paid less than a denarius, then your family, if you have a family, is basically going to go hungry that day. If you're having to kind of work every day for the pay that you're getting. And so here, we have these people who are waiting for work and being hired and going into the vineyard to work. And some of them have worked all day long, and they kind of signed a contract at the beginning of the day. I'm going to work all day and I'm going to get paid a denarius. And others that came in later on, when he went out again, they were hiring people later in the day, and they weren't really giving them any kind of contract that this is what you're going to get paid. He wasn't telling them. They just says, we just want to work. No one hired us, so that's why we're standing here. And so there wasn't kind of that contract or signed agreement about how much money that they were going to get. So what have you all always gotten out of this story?
God's grace is for everybody.
Life isn't fair.
But the gig economy is not a new idea.
You're our Peter today, Kathy. And Barclay is saying that this story is kind of a warning, to the disciples, in that you've been with me all this time. You've received great privileges, that others will come later, to be disciples, who it doesn't matter whether they came early or late or when they came, that they'll still claim a special honor, that everyone is precious. Even though you've been with me all this time, the lost sheep is just as precious to me, as you who have been with me all this time.
It speaks to me of capital punishment.
Huh?
Yeah, well, I know most of you will be surprised, but I'm against capital punishment, because I think right up to the end, you hope a human being will, change, repent, and find God. So if you kill them, they can't. But, let's say that guy's been in prison 30 years, finally finds God, a week before he dies. Well, he still gets to go to heaven, just like the rest of us who, have been trying for longer than that. Yeah. So I guess, it comes to my mind a lot when I think about capital punishment. I'm very against that, because, even if it's last minute.
You're all children of God, and we're all loved by God.
Right.
Right. Well, I think it also illustrates, I think Jesus is telling us that you may work all your life as a loyal servant to God, but that doesn't mean you get an extra privilege in heaven. And
Okay, the only thing though is that I truly believe when I go to heaven, Billy Graham's going to be in the front row and I'm just going to squeak in the back door, and I'm okay with that because I don't deserve to be in the front row. He does.
that's, I would argue with you on that one, Claire.
Barclay also says this is a warning to the Jewish people that Jews, who he's a lot of the people he's speaking with, of course, because he's in Judea now, in the district of Judea, heading toward Jerusalem. And he says that Jews always thought we're the chosen people, and they look down on many other people, the Gentiles. And so this, he's saying that this attitude threatens to carry over into the Christian faith too, or into what the new teachings, the way that Jesus is teaching. And for God, there is not a most favored clause, is what Barclay says. He also says that it means that no matter when we enter the kingdom, we are equally dear to God. And they mentioned, Barclay mentioned a 12 gates in Revelation, some of them facing east and west, and he kind of ties that into people who were coming either early or into heaven early or late in life. And I thought, well, that's kind of a stretch, isn't it? But that's one way to think about it. And he also quoted a rabbi saying that a rabbi had some enter the kingdom in an hour, some hardly enter in a lifetime. And I think, Harold, that kind of speaks to what you were talking about. At the very end of your lifetime, you may come to God. He talks to us about, Barclay talks to us about the compassion of God is shown in this, that he asks in this passage, he asks, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing? And that's the people says, because no one has hired us, they answered. And yet the master gives them a denarius a day, just like all of the others. And Barclay is saying that the great truth for all those who work is the right for everyone to work, and the right that everyone has to earn a living wage for that work. Which this is written when back in Barclay's day, about a living wage for the work that you do. And I remember when I was, the summer before Bud and I got married, I was hired, I was a waitress in a Big Boy or one of those restaurants, fast food kind of restaurants. And they paid $1 an hour for you to work as a waitress in this restaurant. And so when anyone would—
It was pretty good pay, because I was paid 75 cents an hour at the daycare center. So.
$1 an hour. And so if anyone said, what is your favorite meal here? I say, well, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat here. I was only there for 3 months. So my work ethic was not very good because of what they were paying me. But you got your tips, and you didn't get to keep your tips. So that was basically, I got my wage was in hot fudge cake that they served, and strawberries. Whenever I go into the freezer, you get nice strawberries. So I didn't have a very good work ethic there. And it says, it shows the generosity, of God, that all service ranks the same with God. It's not the amount of service given, but the love in which it is given that matters. So I wasn't very loving in my work that I did at Big Boy restaurant,
Well, we can tell how long ago Barclay wrote this, because he still thought that people should work to get money.
That's right. all God gives us is of grace. We cannot earn what God gives us. We cannot deserve it. God gives out of goodness of his heart. What God gives is not pay, but a gift, not a reward, but grace. That's what Barclay states about this particular passage, that the whole point of work is the spirit in which the work is done. He also talks a little bit about the two classes of workers here. He says the first came to an agreement with their master. They had a contract and they agreed for working all day for a denarius. The second group that came later had no contract. All they wanted was the chance to work, and they left the amount of the reward up to their master. Any other thoughts about that particular aspect of this?
Well, a thing that comes to mind, I've talked about the Moravians, and one of their traditions to me illustrates this passage, in that in their cemeteries, all the gravestones are flat markers and they're all the same size. There was a period of time, and this has gone back 300 years now, 250 years that they've been doing this. There was a period of time during late 1800s, early 1900s, that there were some obelisks, but they were mostly used for children. But otherwise, everybody else, their markers are flat and they're the same size. And that was because their belief that in death, everyone is equal. So even if you were a distinguished leader in the Moravian church, your marker is the same size as the guy that came once a year.
And I just thought about that it never occurred to me that in a military cemetery, all of the markers are the same, but in a traditional cemetery, they're not.
Right. Huh.
This parable always reminded, I associated it with the prodigal son, because there's the other brother who's, got his nose to the grindstone and doing everything he's supposed to do. The other one goes off, squanders his inheritance, comes back, and the father says, "Oh, I'm so happy, let's kill the fatted calf." And the other brother was like, "Well, wait a minute, that's not fair." This goes back to Kathy's life's not fair thing. But the joy of recovering the lost sheep, I think, is the point.
Yeah. Well, I think too, at this point in our lives, most of us have experienced enough where life wasn't fair. And I think most of us here have figured out how to move on anyway, and so I look at this, I experience this passage very differently than I did when I was in my teens or 20s. When I was in my teens and 20s, I had a real hard time understanding this. But now it's like, yep, I understand this now. I understand how God's love is available to everybody.
And he ends this with, the last will be first and the first will be last. And remember, he also had mentioned in the passage that pay the last people first. Okay, take your, but he said something like, equal to the work of the heat of the day, blah, blah, blah. So, he says, beginning with the last ones hired and going to the first. That's how he wanted the payment to see, because he wanted the people who had worked all day to see what the people were getting that came in later.
I actually had an experience like that where I was the one that came in at the end. I worked for 2 weeks over my Christmas break, being a bookkeeper for a small business several years ago. Their full-time bookkeeper had broken her hip, and my doing the job temporarily gave them time to do a thorough search and not hire somebody out of desperation. and he gave Christmas bonuses. And I got the same Christmas bonus that everybody else did. And my friend who worked there all year and was responsible for me getting the job was not happy for me. But the owner explained it to me that, you know, I was a professor and had more education and more knowledge. And that was his way of, because he was paying me the same thing he paid the bookkeeper. And he said, this is my way of paying you what you're really worth. But she was not happy.
I remember we were all at a Christmas party, and that's where they always handed out our Christmas bonuses. And everyone got a check, and I opened mine up and it said 0. Okay, because everyone had gotten, I had it planned that when I get a paycheck, I put X number of dollars always goes to the pay my taxes.
Mhm.
And so when they did the check, they forgot to, to cancel that out. And so I got 0,
A check for $0.
as check for $0 because it all went, my $300 went to the federal government. They got my bonus that year. It says Christians work for the joy of serving God and others. That is why the first will be last and the last will be first. Many who have earned great rewards will have a very lowly place in the kingdom because the reward were their sole thought. Those who were poor will be great in the kingdom because they have never thought in terms of the reward, but worked for the thrill of working and for the joy of serving.
Hey, Claire, you can sit on the front bench.
I understand that that's what this is saying. I just, having lived in the world my whole life, I have a hard time. I have a hard time going there.
Well, I think that the topsy-turvy world of heaven is different. Things are reversed in heaven. So the people that you think might be great are going to be in those back seats. And all of the dogs will be in the front seat. Okay. The next passage, I think we'll move on to 17 through 19.
Ready? All right. As he was going up to Jerusalem, Jesus took the 12 disciples apart and said to them while they were on the road, "Look you, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify, and on the third day he will be raised."
Okay, so we've had this story about working in pay and whatever, and Jesus, again, on his way, it says he's going from the district of Judea where he's been and heading now toward Jerusalem. So he's not going up to Jerusalem right now, he's just heading up to Jerusalem at this time. And he's really reminding his disciples and trying to prepare them for what's going to happen when they get there. And Barclay mentions that in Mark, he talks about that there must be a lot of tenseness among the disciples at this time. He says in Mark, Mark says that Jesus was walking ahead by himself when the disciples were walking behind him when this was something that was being said, and that Luke tells us how Jesus took the disciples to himself, or Luke tells how Jesus took the disciples to himself alone, that he might try to compel them to understand what lay ahead. So this is repeated, this particular statement is repeated in both Mark and Luke. And what Barclay is saying is that here Jesus is really describing what's going to happen, the mental, emotional, and physical pain that he's going to be going through. A friend is going to betray him. He's going to be condemned to death by the leaders of the Jewish faith. He's going to be mocked by the Romans, so humiliated. He's going to be, I don't know what they say in this particular one, condemned to death, mocked, and flogged and crucified. So every kind of pain that you can imagine that a person can go through is what he's going to be going through. But then he ends that statement with the last sentence, on the third day, he will be raised to life. So there is still some glory to come here.
I don't know, I think if I was walking along and he says, you know, be mocked, scourged, crucified, and on the third day he will be raised. And I'll be like, raised? What do you mean raised? Raised what? Because it doesn't say raised from the dead. I'll be like,
some questions. I'd like to be the fly on the wall to hear the conversations that took place after that, right?
Yeah.
My version does say, and on the third day he will be raised from the dead.
yeah, and my Jerusalem Bible says he will be raised up again. So why Barclay translated it like that, I don't know, but.
And
Yeah.
Barclay notes that this is the third time in Matthew that Jesus has given this warning to the disciples. And then we move into the next set of verses, unless anyone has anything they want to say about that. Just seems like this is an aside before we move into the next.
But what for me, this is a very strange segue, because we've just had a paragraph that is the most devastating news you could ever hear.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next thing, I've always just found it odd where it says, and then, you know, like it happened right after it. And I'm like, what?
Right. Right. It's
I had to have a segue.
I'm wondering, why did they put this here? I think that I agree with you, Claire.
Well, you know, sort of with that same tone though, looking back.
Right along with the last one, you know, where we have the mother's request here. So would someone like to read the chapter 20? I think it goes through from 20 through 28.
Well, I'll do it.
Okay.
At that time, the mother of Zebedee's sons came to him with her sons, kneeling before him and asking something from him. He said to her, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "Speak the word that these two sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand and one on your left, in your kingdom." Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup which I have to drink?" They said to him, "We can." He said to them, "My cup you are to drink, but to sit on my right hand and my left is not mine to give, but that belongs to those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were angry with the two brothers. Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever wishes to prove himself great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to occupy the foremost place will be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
So in Matthew, the mother of Zebedee's sons, of James and John, comes to Jesus, but in Mark, I think James and John come directly to Jesus. They didn't get their mother involved in it. And one of the exclamations, pardon? I'm sorry. Did I say something wrong?
No, I'm moving furniture right now.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. You held up Matthew and I thought, oh, maybe I used the wrong name. And one of the reasons that Barclay says that is that with Matthew being written later than Mark, that we had already heard some of the things. He tempers some of the things. So he was, rather than saying something negative about about two of the disciples, he says their mom came to Jesus and asked this question.
Okay. That he wants to keep the disciples looking good.
Yeah, he wants the disciples, to they're a little bit, they have a little bit more of a halo around their head now than they might have had before. So that's one of the things that Barclay says might be why Matthew changes this to have the mother coming up. Another thing that I never had thought about before, but Barclay is saying that there is some question about who this mother of the sons of Zebedee were, and that they might have, that actually James and John may have been related in some way to Jesus. And so here the mother of a relative is coming and saying, hey, they should be at your right and the left because we're related, kind of a thing. And I read that in the Catholic Encyclopedia, it said the Catholic Encyclopedia concludes that the Salome of Mark is probably identical with the mother of the sons of Zebedee in Matthew. And they're saying that this woman who is the mother of James and John were a relative of Mary in some way. So that might be another reason that they were kind of coming and asking for special attention for her two sons here. So if Jesus was related to them, it might help explain that a little bit more.
This verse has always been an anomaly for me because I've always wondered if it was something added much later. It's the only place, I think it's the only place where Jesus says anything about his death being sort of as it says here, a ransom for all. No place else does Jesus imply anything like that. Everywhere else, he says his death and resurrection will be proof of who he is, and the miracles are proof of who he is. Never does, I believe this is correct, never in the New Testament anywhere else does it say anything about, as we have kind of, made it into, the blood saves us all. His blood was shed for all, but he never said that except this one spot where he says a ransom. And I've always wondered about the Greek and where that came from, and if that's original, because it is so different than everywhere else I've ever been able to find in the New Testament, at least, especially in the Gospels.
Right.
And Barclay kind of talks about this particular, in Matthew, that he kind of ties in, going back to the fact that they might be related, that in Matthew, it talks about Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee being at the foot of the cross. So that might be another reason that they're kind of tying in and saying that might be related. But yeah, Harold, that might be a good thing for us to study sometime, is going back and seeing, why did Jesus have to die?
I agree. I have so wondered that my whole life. It makes no sense whatsoever. But it used to be, you all know that I used to really dislike Paul, because Paul's theology was different than Jesus in so many ways, until we studied and I learned that Paul didn't write all those letters, and the letters that I was really upset about weren't Paul's letters at all. And now those letters did, go on and on and on about Christ's blood, Christ died for forgiveness of all, that type thing. Paul never really did in his original letters. So, but I remember the assistant minister, Paul, and I used to have this debate all the time, and I kept saying, it's not in there. He kept saying, it is in there. I said, show me, I can't find it. And like I said, I do find what Jesus said about the whole thing, but it's not that, except this one place, this one verse, that's it.
Yeah. Right. Well, and that's a study for another time too. But kind of getting back to this, what Barclay is saying about this particular passage is that it sheds some light on the disciples too, because he says that their ambition is still, they're still thinking of personal reward. Okay, even after we've talked about the camel through the eye of the needle and the rich man and getting into heaven and becoming a servant and that type of thing to all, and they're still saying, I want to be on the right and left hand of you when you're in your kingdom, kind of a thing. So they still wanted Jesus to enter this, wanted Jesus to ensure kind of that they were going to have special treatment of some sort. But Barclay also says there is a pro to this, to the disciples listed here, that they still, even though everything that's going on, even though Jesus says he's going to be going and be crucified and die on the cross, they still have this faith in Jesus that his kingdom's going to come. You know, I want to be on the right and left side of you. You know, they still have that faith and loyalty in what's going to happen, that so much so that they're still willing to say, I want to be on your right and left hand side. And so that ambition, the ambition that lays, he says, the faith and loyalty which lay behind the ambition must not be forgotten. He also talks about, Barclay talks about shedding light on the Christian life, that Jesus says that those who share his triumph must drink his cup. And what cup did James and John eventually drink? And Barclay adds that James, in the end, he was the first disciple to die as a martyr for Jesus. And he mentions that came in Acts. But John, they said, lived to an old age and died a natural death. He was nearly 100 years old. And so he was saying that our cup, when we follow Christ, might mean a lifelong time of service, or it might be something like, you know, James had, where you become a martyr. Some people become a martyr for Christ. Some people might just live a regular life following Christ. He says it also shows the kindness of Jesus and his honesty, and that his trust in his followers, that he didn't, even though here we've been talking all through chapter 19 about rich and all, and becoming a servant, and here these people are still wanting special treatment, and he didn't lose his patience. I would just say, what are you talking about? Didn't you hear what I said in chapter 19? No. He didn't say that, you know, he just tried to explain to them, you know, you'll indeed drink from my cup, you know, but he didn't write them off, that he believes, you know, he believes in us even with all of our faults. Did you get any other things out of this particular passage that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I had never thought about there being a possibility that any of the disciples could have been related to Jesus. And I think, you know, Barclay's thought process on that, you know, I think he makes an assumption that I'm not sure, you know,
even that Catholic encyclopedia, they were thinking that that Salome was related to Mary, and that, you know, so there.
Yeah, and maybe so, you know, a lot of the Catholic stuff, you'll see traditions that came out later, you know, that they incorporate into some of their
And in John,
commentaries.
at the cross, when they're talking about the women at the cross in John, they say Mother Mary of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the sister of Mary. Okay.
Yeah.
So
How the three gospels identify that third woman in a different way.
right. And who knows what happened over the time between when the gospels were written, that who knows what kind of scuttlebutts were going around and what kind of happening.
Yeah.
I wonder about the community that Jesus was born into. When you say they might have been related, it may have been a small enough community that everybody was essentially related. I know where my mother lives in a retirement home that's based around the Apostolic Christian Church. You don't want to talk about anybody because they're all related. So that may be not too far-fetched that in some way they were related.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, I came from West Virginia or the border. I mean, you know, up there, it's not unusual.
Oh, goodness.
No comment.
Yeah. And then after all of this, when the disciples heard, when the 10 that said heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Well, of course, and then Jesus, it says, calls them together and speaks with them and about that. And among Jesus' followers, service is alone. He says, he was saying, Jesus called them together. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. So it's a complete reversal, like we said earlier, of all of the world's standards. It's a complete new set of values that are expected. You know, when you're growing up and trying to figure out what profession you're going to get, you always think, what can I do to make sure that I have a lifestyle like I want? What kind of job am I going to get that's going to pay me money and do this kind of thing? It's a complete reversal when you're thinking about the kingdom of heaven.
Or going to art school.
Or going to art school. That has to be for love.
Truly. Or as in my case, I just lacked any talent that you could earn money from. I have talents, but they don't pay.
Okay, I gotta go, y'all. See you next week.
Thank you,
All
Sarah.
right. Bye, Sarah.
Greatness is going to be determined by how many people we can help. And there was a statement in there by, Barclay gave a little quote by, says, a great Japanese saint, Toyohiko
Kagawa?
Toyohiko Kagawa, when he came to Christ, he said, found out about the Christianity, he said, "Oh God, make me like Christ." That was a quote that he had. And he wrote, God dwells among the lowliest of men. He sits on the dust heap among the prison convicts. He stands with the juvenile delinquents. He is there with the beggars. He is among the sick. He stands with the unemployed. Therefore, let him who would meet God visit the prison cell before going to the temple. Before he goes to church, let him visit the hospital. Before he reads his Bible, let him help the beggar. It says this therein its greatness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And Barclay does go a little bit into that. Says, what does, and I don't know that I follow this logic, but it says he says, Jesus summed up his life in one sentence here in Matthew. The Son of Man came to give his life a ransom for many. And he says, what does this mean? People who were in the grip of a power of evil, people were in the grip of a power of evil that they could not break. This dragged them down and separated them from God. Their sins wrecked their life and the world and God himself. A ransom is something paid or given to liberate people from a situation from which it is impossible for them to free themselves. So Jesus was simply saying it cost the life and death of Jesus Christ to bring men and women back to God. Now that's a question that, Harold's already raised the question too, but Jesus gave everything to bring us to God and to help us. The way I see that is bringing us, teaching us about the nature of God, which I think has gotten distorted within the Jewish tradition of all of the rules and regulations of what it takes to serve God, that you have to follow this 10,000 rules, and Jesus brought it back simply to becoming a servant and to serve and to help others.
And I think too, the ransom is for each of us, what is the most precious thing we have? And that would be our life. And so the concept of giving up the most precious thing you have, and not only that, God only has this, I mean, God created man, but Jesus is his son. So the sacrifice here of him being willing to give up his son, I think that's maybe where we're supposed to understand the significance, that if Jesus didn't die and in some way just came into a kingdom as a ruler, would it have the same impact? Because
Well, and hadn't died, resurrected, would, and have all of the witnesses to the resurrection in the Bible, would we have, what would have happened to the disciples anyway? Would they have just gone on their way? I think that was that action of him being raised and his disciples seeing him and Thomas seeing him and touching him, was what gave them the faith in the hereafter.
I mean, yeah, because the world has had so many rulers over time, but no ruler has been able to conquer death other than Christ. So
Right.
that's
About that once. This was, well, what about Lazarus? And she says, well, Lazarus eventually did die. Jesus raised him, from death to life, and the little girl was dead, and Jesus brought her back. But
I never thought of that. I never thought about that.
Cindy said, eventually they were human, they did die, whereas Jesus has risen. And a number of people, like I think Moses, there were other people who had risen. So it is 10:50, so I don't want to get into the last passage of 20, but we'll have it isn't so much related to these other than it's going to be about the two blind men receiving sight, and that'll end chapter 20 for us. So we'll start with that next week.